Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Two Hard Questions with myself, Jessie Crees, Gerard Nicole, and Eric Castro. Today, we had the pleasure of speaking with Tracy Sedman, who is in sex education, and we asked her the two hardest questions that we could think of regarding sex education. I think the whole discussion was very productive and thought-provoking, and especially the discussion regarding consent and whether it's applied equally amongst the genders, and also just whether the public in general is consenting to the type of sex education that's being pretty much forced upon us and our children. Hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Jess. So how did I fall into sex education? A lot of people ask me that question. My original background is actually in legal. So I worked for many years in legal firms, and then I went on and became a school teacher. And after almost 10 years of becoming a school teaching schools, I went into adult education, so teaching adults. So I spent a couple of years in a business college teaching international students, and then I took a position at family planning in Australia, New South Wales, family planning New South Wales, and that's when I became really passionate about it. So I wrote a program, which I delivered and rolled out across New South Wales, and that was educating youth workers and professionals, working with young people all around what we would describe as sex ed, but what is now known as sexual health education. So a bit of semantics when it comes to the words. So that's when I became really passionate about sex education. So I've taught sex ed as a teacher directly to students. In my role at family planning, on occasions I did teach directly with health promotions officers directly to students as well. But I was teaching and doing professional development for teachers, youth workers, and anyone in a professional industry who was working with young people. So that's where my passion began, and and I'm going to continue in that in my own capacity. So yeah, very, very interested in the topic.
Excellent. We ready to pass it over to Gerard for question number one?
Okay.
Hit me with
Bye,
it,
Tracy.
Gerard. Hello.
Okay. Tracy, these are the hardest questions we could come up with on the topic of sex education. So I'm going to ask one, and then Eric's going to ask one later. Now, my question is, as I understand it, the majority of sex educators are women. My question to you is, what effect does it have having a majority of women develop sex education programs? And if men were in sex ed in equal numbers, how would the programs change?
You know, that's such a really, really good question. And you're right. I mean, I'm female. The educators I worked with were all females. The educators who I spoke with from other organisations are females. Though I am aware of one male educator. He's from an LGBTI organisation. But in general terms, so he was speaking about something very specific. So he was speaking about, you know, his sex ed program was for a particular audience. But in the general sense, sexual health or sex ed education, that's such a good question. You know what? It's something that I've never really considered, but when I think about it, I think it would be very different. I think there'd be a lot of differences. Speaking from my experience, I found when I was writing the program and when I was delivering the program, there were a lot of competing agendas going on when I was writing that program and in the delivery and in the participants in the workshops. So there was a theme, an undercurrent theme of we're holding men responsible, that Western male is responsible for all the bad things that are happening when it comes to sexual health or sex education. So men were quite stigmatized. So I think to have that male input Jared, you and I have spoken before, but not specifically about this. Seeing it from a men's point of view, I'm going to give you one example. Let's talk about vibrators. Okay, so this can be quite explicit to really break down that question that you've asked. When the conversation of vibrators comes up in sex ed, whether it's with teachers or youth workers or other professionals, or with the older high school students, it's always the female vibrator. We never talk about the vibrators that are available for men. Okay, that's a non-issue. It's never spoken about.
I never heard of it.
Yeah, well, there are male vibrators for men. And, if you want to go one step further, we have sex toys, okay? And people make jokes about the blow-up dolls for men. But at the end of the day, they're a vibrator, they're a sex toy. But men are made fun of if they're using vibrators, or a sex doll. Whereas for women to use a vibrator or some kind of sex aid or sex toy, it's a big empowering thing. It's, she can do it herself. So
Tracy, just to pull you up on that, I think when Eric said he hadn't heard of this, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, are you questioning more that in sex ed programs we're even talking about vibrators, or that we're not talking about men's vibrators?
The latter.
Okay, so you were aware that in these sex ed programs they do talk about sex toys and things like vibrators.
Sorry. I meant as a whole, as society, we don't talk about it.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Sorry to interrupt your flow.
So yeah, we can unpack it as a whole, okay, and we can bring it down to, as Eric said, we don't talk about vibrators as a whole, okay, in sex ed classes. Like I said, you'd be talking in that upper year 11, year 12. Students might question it. There may be a question from a younger student, but when I'm saying younger, I'm talking maybe year 9, year 10, or, you'll get the odd student in year 7 saying, what's a vibrator? In professional development with teachers, yeah, it can be spoken about because someone will often bring it up. So, but it's always from that female perspective and the female sex aid or sex toy, be it for fun or it could be for health reasons. And another thing that we don't speak about is we talk about the condoms. So whenever we're talking about condoms, it's always the male condom, okay? No one very rarely speaks about the female condom, and there is a female condom, and it does exist, okay? There's a discrepancy in prices, there's a discrepancy in availability, but it's the fact that we talk about, the man using a condom, the man taking responsibility. We always seem to be putting the responsibility back onto the man. The man has to use it. Well, let's start talking a little bit more about the female condom. And that now that Gerard's mentioned it from that male point of view, well, do we ever consider what a condom feels like for a male to wear? So I think that if we were to have a male in that sex ed role, we'd be talking about vibrators from a male point of view and what's out there for them. The condoms is a really, really important one because, as we know, condoms are a barrier to STIs and BBVs, and they're also protection against contraception. So I think, we can really focus on the condoms and start looking at it more from a male perspective. So I think that's something that really needs to be considered. And I know moving forward, now that you've raised it, Gerard, I'm going to be very much more mindful of taking male perspectives, and I, welcome male contribution to it, because I think we do need to start considering sex education, sexual health education from a male perspective, getting their input. I think that's really good. I mean, even if we talk about consent, that's another thing that we talk about in sex ed, sexual health, relationships. Again, it's very much from a female point of view, and quite often I know from experience, we're actually stigmatizing men all over again. There's so much. Gee, we could discuss this particular question, Gerard, for a long time. We could really unpack it. We could really break it down. The consent.
Was it ever discussed in in, you know, the groups of people who do sex ed, the lack of diversity, that I would imagine that if you were teaching another subject and every person in the room was a man except for one lesbian woman, that someone might actually point out that, you know, maybe we should have some women in the room. Is it ever spoken about in sex ed forums that we're all women here and we need to get some male perspective and some men into the industry?
Look, I did break, you know, sometimes I did say I'd like to know a man's perspective on it, but it's not, no. The bottom line is no. A male perspective is not invited. And when I say male, I'm talking white heterosexual male who does not identify as anything other than white heterosexual. In terms of males being in the conversation, yeah, there's been men who identify as being gay, or women who identify as being men in a sense of trans. They've been involved, but the white heterosexual male, no.
So basically the very people who are being lectured to about being responsible are the group who are not at all represented in creating the curriculum.
That's correct. In my experience, when, you know, I did this over a 2-year period, no, there was never ever a white heterosexual male asked for his input or his ideas. So, I mean, when I wrote the program, so I would talk with other people. The program would be sent up the line for approval, and to my knowledge, all those people who were approving it were females. My consultation was with Aboriginal people, females again. Consultation with LGBTIQ community, again, it was predominantly females or people who I didn't identify, who they themselves were gender neutral. But no, there was never really, or males who identified as gay. But no, there was never that white heterosexual male input. So I found when I was delivering the program and I had the white heterosexual male or the Western or the European, okay, or even the Middle Eastern person, male person who identified as heterosexual, they would often pull me up, particularly around matters to do with consent. So because there was always this, the responsibility was always being placed back onto the man to ask, or if there were scenarios where it was, you know, is this consent or isn't this consent? It was always a male blaming kind of game that was going on.
The feedback that I'm getting, you know, from my own kids, and also in other things that I'm reading, is that both boys and girls now are starting to go through these programs, and the questions that they're asking at the end have to do with the inconsistencies they're being taught internally within the programs. So, you know, it's not just boys, but girls are saying, hey, wait a minute, you know, you keep telling us that, you know, men and women are equal, but you've just told us that if a boy and girl get drunk, that the boy raped the girl. How could that possibly be? And, you know, yeah, sorry.
No, you're right. That's one of the topics that I get really passionate about is because, you know, there's a particular activity that I would do where 2 scenarios, and the scenarios are both the same, except they're switched as to who would be the perpetrator. And whenever it was the male in that situation as being the perpetrator, the majority of the females and the class would go to, oh, that's not consent. But whenever they looked at the female card, and the female was the perpetrator, that they would say the opposite. They would say, oh no, she's consenting. They would start finding excuses to excuse her behavior. But it's the same. Both weren't consenting. Both of their respective partners weren't consenting. But there's this stigma of blaming the men. As you said, the inconsistencies. And there are inconsistencies. You know, they say we have to now teach men to ask for sex. Why aren't we teaching females to ask for sex? Why
exactly
aren't we responsibility back onto the females? So that was things that I always found was, you know, they have this fries concept of, you know, consent is freely given and it's irrevocable and it has to be specific. But the focus is on the male to be asking that consent. But there never seems to be a focus on the women having to ask that consent. And I can tell you, you know, I had some pretty hot discussions, some vocal discussions with, you know, other female educators, and they would just turn their back and not want to have the discussion. So the topics, the points that you're raising, Gerard, are really, really important, and we need to consider having those conversations. And I know, you know, I'm trying to launch my own Sexual Safety Australia program, and I want to have that focus where, you know, it's not all men that are bad, it's women that are equally bad as well. If we want to demonize men, then we have to demonize women equally. Yeah, you're giving me some really good thinking points, Gerard, because it's so true. I know that I've spoken with educators, teachers of juvenile detention centres, and a lot of the boys that end up in these centres, it's because they really don't know the concepts of consent. And if we just take the time to unpack it with them, but when I raised that with other female educators and said, you know, we need to take the time and unpack it, they were absolutely beside themselves. They're like, oh no, boys know. And it's like, well, how do boys know? If we've got adults who don't understand these concepts, how do you expect young boys, teenage boys, to understand these concepts? But there's that general stigma going on. There's that general underlying that boys know, but boys don't know. Okay, just as much as girls.
I think it goes beyond that, though, that if you're not subject to a particular right, why would you care about that right? So, you know, if you're a male and, you know, no one ever asks you for consent, who in their right mind would expect you to understand that you need to ask others for consent? But, you know, I would have just thought that, you know, applying the, you know, the Christian golden rule, that, you know, even if 100% of sexual assault was committed by men, which it isn't, you would still think in theory that you would teach men that they also have rights, and that if they expect their rights to be upheld, that they have to uphold other people's rights. It just seems crazy to me that just as a basic principle, that within these sex ed programs, people don't understand even the concept of inclusivity. That, you know, these people like to talk about inclusivity, but in what we're teaching our kids, there's no inclusivity of even the male right to say no. It seems that these people believe that if a male has an erection, that's consent.
Well, not only do they think that it's consent, but they also now take it a step further and say that they get offended by a male who has an erection, you know, and some people are seeing that as an assault because you have an erection and they didn't ask for it. And that's like, well, what did they do to make that happen? So, you know, it's the areas that we need to continue to unpack. And I know that moving forward, I want education to be, like you're saying, more of a balance, more of inclusivity. You know, let's get males' opinions on it, because, yeah, you know, it goes back to your question. It's females. Are there males that are involved? And the bottom line is, from my experience, no. So this kind of conversation, I think we can extend it. We could talk about it for hours and unpack each one. But, you know, what you're saying is so true. And I hear it so much from, you know, the men that have been in the workshops. As you said, how can we expect them, well, boys, to give respect, and when we're not teaching them respect either? They have the right to say no as well. But I know from my experience, female educators and, you know, even educators from LGBTIQ, they laugh and scoff at that kind of thought process that a man would say no. They kind of don't see it, you know.
Which is odd considering, even if you just take into account homosexuality, that surely a heterosexual male needs to be taught that he has a right to say no to a homosexual male?
Look, I think the right to say no needs to be taught from a young age, male or female, because, you know, young kids don't understand their sexuality, you know, at a very young age. But if we teach that they all have the right to say no and they all have the right to be asked, you know, I think that's a fair point. And then as they grow into their sexuality, or as their sexuality emerges, they're all confident, you know, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexuality, they're all confident to say no. But I've got a lot of thoughts going in my head, because you trigger your questions. It's like, oh, I need to make sure I do this next time, and I need to make sure I consider this, you know, and making sure that there is that balance. But I think it's going to be, you know, I'm just one person who can try to push that balance face to face and in education programs, sex education programs. And there's a lot of women out there who teach sex ed that it's, you know, I'm just going to be one voice against many, but I certainly will be doing my best.
So it sounds to me like the sex education program people need some sex education before they even talk to other people.
Well, it's true, because we need to be more inclusive. I mean, we keep, you know, banging on about this inclusivity, but as you have raised, the inclusivity always seems to be the LGBTIQ community, the Aboriginal and CALD communities, the communities of people with disability. I mean, they're the people who I consulted with to write this specific program. But there's that, the underlying theme is always the white heterosexual male is to blame for women not having orgasms, for women getting pregnant, for women catching STIs. It's all your fault, Gerard. Sorry. You know, for the rapes and sexual assaults that have occurred. And, you know, as I said in my intro, I spent nearly 20 years of my life involved in working in legal firms. And a lot of that was to do with criminal as well. So I saw a lot of cases, you know, that passed my desk. I mean, I wasn't a lawyer, but, you know, I had a lot to do with case files. You know, so I've seen a lot. You know, one of those cases that sticks out for me, which we're all aware of, is that Lazarus case. Jess and Eric in Australia, in New South Wales, it was a really big case. It was the focus of consent. You know, and when you actually sit down, now I took the time and I sat down and I read through all those case files, through all the case transcripts that were put out. And that was my trigger moment for consent, and saying, well, hang on a second, we're not teaching consent correctly. But with Gerard's question, you raised it, you know, it goes even further. We've still got a long way to go in switching the responsibility. You know, we want to, the latest thing in sexual education, sexual health education, sex ed, is the onus is on the man to be asking for consent. That needs to switch and become more diverse. The onus is on both people to be asking for consent, and both have a responsibility to say no. If you don't want it, say no. You know, you have a voice, you have a tongue, you know, say no. And I know that in terms of some people, you know, break it down a little bit further. Some people do have a disability and they are unable to speak. So, you know, you've got your hand gestures, you've got your face expressions, you know, teaching both sexes, you know, what does no look like if you can't speak? What are you looking for? So if someone's squinching and, you know, pushing away, they're clearly not interested. And that works for, you know, a male as well. I mean, I look back and you know, some boys that I might have hit on in my day, and you can tell by their body language, they're not interested. But
I think though that presumes though that you're sober yourself. That it seems perverse to me that you could have a guy who's drunk and a girl who's drunk, but the guy is somehow meant to be reading body language when the girl isn't. You know, the girl could in fact, you know, be an active participant. And if the law was applied equally, the way rape is currently defined, you could in theory have a male and a female both being charged for raping each other.
That's
and
correct.
The only thing that stops that the only thing that stops that is gender bias. That if a male and a female both accuse each other of having sex while drunk, the only thing that stops police from charging both of them with rape is the gender bias that, the male is somehow responsible.
Yeah, and that's that underlying theme that's coming through sex ed today, is that the onus is always being put on the male to ask for consent. So we're still reinforcing that he's the ultimate responsible one, therefore he's the bad one, and that needs to change. Because like you said...
That infantilizes women, that it takes all agency away from women. And if women want to be equal in a society, how can you hold men accountable for the things that women are doing themselves?
Yeah, and that's where it comes back to, one of the agendas is, women have been, infantilized from birth, but not necessarily, These are considerations that, like we could talk about consent and the rape, that in itself, and sexual assault is one whole topic that you could talk for hours and unpack, because you are correct that for me, I've been asking that same question. I always say, well, what happens if both are drunk? And it always does seem to be the male that gets held responsible. When you look at education videos that are out there on YouTube, like you can go to YouTube and type in consent, and all these videos will come up, and it's always the male that's being held responsible. And you never see those gender roles switched either. So at the end of the day, when I look at sex ed programs to date and the videos and the education, the language that's out there, I think that there is an argument to be put by men that it is still stigmatizing men. It is holding men more to account than it is females. It's taking the agency away from females. Look, a lot of these are questions that I've banged my head in discussions with other educators, and they just don't want to know about it.
And just finally on this, let's say I'm a parent and I come along to one of these sex ed programs, or a briefing session about the sex ed program, and I basically raise all of these issues with the presenter. Look, are you about to teach my son that he has no sexual value and that he has to, ask women for sex and they don't have to ask him? How would they respond? Or is this something that parents just aren't asking the educators?
Okay, a forum like that, because I will say that I've had males ask me similar questions. The programs that I've written and the way in which I've had to deliver, as an employee, I have to follow the values of what was given to me. And a lot of those questions, I would be sitting there in my head going, I so agree with you. But in my roles that I've had, I have to uphold the values of the organisations that I work for.
So how would you respond? How would you respond to me if we're in a hall full of 500 parents and you're up the front and I stood up and said, what is it with you teaching our children this gender bias? Are you just going to basically brush my question aside? And how would you answer that? If you can't say, yes, you're right, how would you answer me?
Okay, so quite often as educators, if it's a question that we don't want to deal with, and that specific question, if it's going to go against what we have to, the messages that we have to deliver, we would probably deflect to talk to you after the session, maybe unpack it a little bit, like that specific question. If I was doing it myself, my answer for myself would be very different to the answer that I would give you as an employee of an organisation. That's been the bottom line, because I have to uphold their values. I know another educator, her response would be, well, thank you for your question, but, research shows, and we would give you a whole spiel of research showing that what you're saying is not correct. Selective research.
And then I would stand up and I would give you my research, And I'm guessing here that, you know, it would end with me being dragged out of the group and as an example to everybody else.
Potentially. But do you know what? You're the person that's asking the question for another 250 silent people that are sitting in that room. And the educators would be very uncomfortable in trying to answer that. And that's why, you know, I'd like to do my own sexual health education and sex ed education, because what you're asking is very valid. They are very good points, and they need to be unpacked to young students. They need to be unpacked to teenagers. They need to be unpacked to the rest of the world, really, when we're going to talk about sex ed, because, you know, the research that anyone picks to support their particular programs is selective. Okay, I could pull out research and I could just, you know, pick a particular piece and say, oh, look, this research, you know, supports, this is what I'm, you know, just to say, Gerard, you're wrong. Everything that you said, you're wrong. I could pick up some research and I could send it to you and say, look, Gerard, you're wrong. But as you said, you could equally pull up some research and it will support exactly what you're saying. Okay, and I, look, it's hard for me to step out of those previous roles that I've worked in. But I know, Gerard, that what you're saying, there's a lot of truth to it. There's a lot of validity to it. And from, as I said, as one person, you know, I want to push that kind of more equal message, because it has been missing. Bottom line is, it's been missing. In my experience, I found that it's missing. And I find that we're doing more harm than good. We're holding men to account. We're holding men to ransom, but we're not giving agency and a voice to females. So in fact, you know, that kind of agenda is actually doing more harm to women. So yeah, I'm just laughing at a lot of what, you know, the question, because I've been in a room where similar questions have been asked, and me as an employee, I have almost started shaking, because I know what I would like to say. I know what answer I have to give. So, yeah, I'm still unshackling myself from those kind of agenda-driven programs that I've taught throughout schools and in my, you know, career as an educator, be it solely as a sex educator or solely as a school teacher. Yeah, I feel that I've been very shackled in what the answers can be.
It's really interesting.
That's all I have for that question.
All right. Well, in that case, that was a lot to think about. I'm sure we'll all have a lot of thoughts after the show to go over, but let's go ahead now and pass it to Eric for question number 2. Okay.
Ready?
Now we're ready.
Much better.
Hi, Tracy.
Hey, Eric, how are you?
Doing well. How are we transitioning conservative minorities such as Muslims and natives into Western sex education?
How are we doing it?
Yes.
Basically, sex ed is a one-size-fits-all approach in Australia. In my experience in writing sex ed programs, or, you know, being one part of a writer of sex ed programs, we consult with called communities. And even so, in writing the professional development, the consultation with called communities is typically consultation with females. So it goes back to what Gerard said, who are we discussing it with? So it's typically with females, and a lot of older people, like our age, Gerard's and my age, and then we would be considering some research, which may have, when you look at research, they'll have their particular group that they're researching. So a lot of it relies on research. But if you're in school, if you have a child in school, so I'm going to talk specifically about Muslims, because I've had a lot of experience with Islamic schools, because I actually worked in an Islamic college, which was K-12, and as an educator. So in terms of Islamic values in schools. If I was in the Islamic college, your values will be highly upheld. It will all be from the Islamic point of view. Okay, and I don't have an issue with that. I don't have an issue with any religious school teaching their values and beliefs, as long as we're also teaching the safety aspect as well. So, you know, there might be conversations, age-appropriate conversations for, you know, around condoms and maybe contraception. Again, it's up to those individual schools. The school I taught in, I know in the upper years, they didn't talk about contraception to, you know, year 7 and 8, but to the year 12s, they did mention contraception and they did educate about contraception. Same with other religious schools, you know, the conversations are happening around contraception, but in the sense of this is what it is and this is what it will do. They're not there to promote it, but they are talking about it. And again, that's fine. You don't have to sit there, you know, forcing each other's agendas down each other's throats. But in public schools, it is a one-size-fits-all approach. And if you are a young Islamic student, if you are a young Christian student, if you are a young Jewish student, the only option is for your parents to opt you out of sex ed classes. Apart from that, you will get the same lesson as everybody else. And over the last couple of years, those lessons do not include any kind of religious teachings. There is no kind of values in terms of religious values being attached to sex education.
Should it be, though?
Look, I think this is the problem. This is where all the agendas, we've got all these competing agendas going on. In terms of teaching abstinence to children and to young students in the public system, the answer is no. That word is a dirty word to talk about.
Abstinence?
Abstinence. Okay? It is not to be mentioned. When I did want to mention it, I didn't exactly get a golden star, but no, it's the word abstinence is a very dirty word in sex ed.
Is abstinence associated with religion? Is that why?
Yes.
Yes, they current sexual health, you know, hierarchy sees abstinence as being something to be associated with religion.
It's a good practice, though.
Well, you have the ABCD of sex ed, okay, which is practice abstinence. Okay, if you can't be abstinent, then be faithful. Okay, if you can't be faithful, then use a condom. And if condoms haven't worked or a condom wasn't about, then detect early. Okay, detect pregnancy early, detect STIs early. So the abstinence, the ABCD is kind of like a watered down religious concept, so to speak. I've now seen that ABCD hijacked, for want of a better term, by groups who now say, well, let's, when we talk about abstinence, we're talking about abstinence from casual sex, okay, or abstinence from multiple partners. So the word's being redefined, its meaning is being redefined. But I think that it's been quite negligent not to mention the words abstinence. Like when we talk about contraception protection or STI protection, okay, if we were to put all the forms down, you know, list all the forms of contraception, all the forms of STI, BBV protection, abstinence in current sex ed in Australia does not get a mention in the public system. It is not to be mentioned.
And Tracy, on that subject, I was having a discussion with another parent about the subject of abortion. Now, I was saying to them that, you know, from, I think, a rational solution to addressing abortion in sex education, which it is these days, is to say to people that, you know, if you believe in abortion, then, you should be having sexual relationships with people who share your values. And that if you're also very pro-life, that, you should avoid having sex with people who, would abort a child. And to me, that seems like a perfect compromise. It's saying, look, you should be having, sexual relationships with the people who share your values to avoid inevitable conflicts about choice. But I then explained to the parent that there's no way on earth that the sex educators would allow that discussion to be had, because their agenda is normalizing abortion. And I don't see why they couldn't accommodate people with conservative views on abortion by simply saying that if you have conservative views on abortion, you should only have relationships with people who share your conservative views.
No, there doesn't seem to be a compromise. And what you're saying is too logical, because then what you're saying, I'm giving you like what the argument back that I would hear from other people in the industry is that's impinging the rights to have enjoyable sex, that I should be allowed to have sex with someone, whoever I want, regardless of what their views and values are. It's kind of like this reactive, instead of being proactive and preventing unintended pregnancies or preventing STIs, we seem to have flipped and we've now become reactive. And let's not worry about what your values and beliefs are. Let's have sex because it's great and it's fun, and let's worry about the consequences afterwards. And therefore, if I want to have an abortion, then I'm entitled to have an abortion. Yeah, being proactive seems to have gone out the door. I don't know, it's bizarre. I find it quite bizarre, because the questions that you're asking, the question that Eric asked about Muslim people and Islamic beliefs, all the other religious beliefs, they're all being pushed aside. You're bringing up a set of values, and those values kind of don't fit with the sex education that they want out there. The sexual health messaging is that sex is great, and it is. Sex is enjoyable, and it is. But you have to have two consenting adults, and as long as you've got two consenting adults or two consenting people, everything else is irrelevant.
Wow.
So, the old, in the old-fashioned sex ed was about abstinence. It was about having some values, but I don't know, the values seem to have switched, and the values seem to be coming after the fact, not before the fact. Like what you're saying, Jared, makes sense. If you want to have sex and you're pro-life, you do want to try to have sex with someone who is pro-life. You share the same values. So you could be having sex. It comes down to different people have sex for different reasons. Okay. So you do have a lot of people who will only have sex for the sake of having children. They see it as procreation, and that's fine. I totally respect those values. Sometimes you look at them and you really admire them. That's how they view sex. Then you've got the other end of the spectrum where, it's all about sex is fun, sex is great, sex is enjoyable, and I want to have sex with as many partners as I want and who I want. That's fine too. You're entitled to that.
Is it fine though? Is it
Sorry?
okay for that kind of lifestyle?
Well, for me, I've come to the conclusion that for me, I can accept other people's lifestyle choices. That's how I've because I've come from a conservative Christian background.
So do we.
But so I've learned I want my values respected. For me, this is what sex is about. This is what marriage is about. I want those respected. My compromise is, well, I'm going to respect your values and beliefs. Just don't shove it down my throat.
Which is to use the term, you've used the term shove it down my throat several times now, which is kind of quite ironic given the content that we're discussing here.
No, I can
and
take
that,
it a couple of ways.
but that seems to me to be the great irony here, that the people who are teaching consent to our children are the people who seem to have no concept of consent in any other sense. And even in the sexual
For
consent,
ideas.
yes, that, you know, I would consider myself to have quite liberal sexual views, but I think it's just gross hypocrisy to go into a Muslim school and not talk about homosexuality at all, and then have a Muslim student in a public school who has to sit there like a mute as they're taught that homosexuality is completely normal. And you know, my last name starts with an N, and I went through high school with a lot of Vietnamese, because most Vietnamese have the last name Nguyen. And I watched as, you know, the teachers, you know, taught a very Marxist agenda to children who had escaped communism. And it seems strange to me that a Muslim student in a public school who is being integrated has to sit there in the corner and can't actually say, well, you know, in my religious view, homosexuality is worse than murder. That to me seems very oppressive and non-inclusive.
Yeah, and I think sex ed in Australia has hit the point of too many competing agendas, and it's I think to a large extent it's failing, because, as I said, I keep using that term, shoving it down our throats, because we are still only, instead of teaching sexual safety, the focus seems to be on teaching agendas.
I agree.
That's my bottom line. That's been my experience, that, you know, we should be out there teaching about STIs, BBV, contraception, consent, you know, both partners have responsibility. But instead I feel, you know, even my own children, I've got 2 daughters, okay? One of them still at school, and she'll come home and tell me things that she's been taught from other organisations. You know, it's not just one organisation that teaches sex ed. There's a whole lot of organisations that are doing professional development and teaching sex ed in schools. And it comes down to the person that's standing in front of you. And I've just seen values ripped away, and it's just been very agenda driven. That's the bottom line. For me.
And Tracy, before Jessie asks her last question, one of the things that you've told me about, which I was completely oblivious to, that I'd like to just quickly discuss here, is that the drug PrEP. That I don't think most parents understand that PrEP exists or what it is. Would you just be able to quickly explain to us what PrEP is and how it's being used?
Yeah, so PrEP is a drug that's come onto the market. It's to look again. It comes down to who are you getting the information from, because you can look at different websites and they're going to tell you different information. Now, PrEP is a drug out there for HIV. Okay, HIV prevention. Is how I've been educated about it. Okay, so if you are engaged in homosexual activities, it's mainly steered towards men, gay men. You can take PrEP, a pill a day, and it will reduce your chances of contracting HIV. Now, I really emphasize the word reduce, okay? Because in my time when I was doing education, sexual health education, I have seen organisations tell people it will prevent you from getting HIV. It is not 100% prevention, okay? Some of the research that I looked at gives the coverage of anywhere from 76% up to 94% protection against HIV. Okay, so it's, you know, it's like the contraceptive pills and all the methods of contraception. Nothing is 100% guaranteed to prevent you. So PrEP is widely spoken in sex ed classes when we're talking about STIs and BBV. So PrEP is out there. It is available from your doctors. It came onto the PBS in Australia, I think about 2 years ago. And I believe the date was like April 1st, 1918, I think it was. 2018. Sorry, 1918. That's taken us back a bit. 2018. Yeah, so that in a short sense, that's what PrEP is. Okay.
And is PrEP being pushed to heterosexuals as well, or is it mainly being pushed to homosexuals?
It's always spoken about when we talk about STIs and BBVs. PrEP is always mentioned. So regardless if you're talking about homosexual sex or heterosexual sex, PrEP is always mentioned because we talk about it in the STIs. So it's an STI BBV prevention. That's how it's
spoken. And in the US, I don't think they've moved on to the whole STI acronym yet. They're still using STD. So
yeah.
an STI is a sexually transmitted infection, which is more politically correct than a disease, right?
Yes, I have an issue with education around STIs, you know, whether you look at whether you're getting it face-to-face or whether you're getting it off the internet. This theme has kind of come across that they're seen as STIs of no consequence, okay? Whereas, so the whole idea around STIs and BBVs and HIV
and what's a BBV?
Bloodborne virus. So your bloodborne virus.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so HIV fits into the BBV category, but quite often you'll see HIV and all the BBVs just sitting under STIs. So that's the, you know, they're all generalized under as STIs. So there's been this theme, this undercurrent of STIs of no consequence. You know, if you get an STI, no worries, just pop on down to a clinic and you'll get a tablet and you'll be fine. You know, if you don't want to get HIV, you know, you could take PrEP, you could take a pill a day. You know, and PrEP's only relatively new, and there are consequences. This is one of my concerns when it comes to sex ed, is we've tried to destigmatize these kind of diseases, infections, and BBVs, but by destigmatizing it, we've also removed the seriousness nature of these diseases, infections, and BBVs, whichever word you want to use for it. Because in Australia, as you said, we use STIs, we use the word infections rather than diseases. That to me is, you know, watering it down again, that it's just an infection, you'll be fine, take a magic pill and you'll all be, you know, you'll be good to go. Give it a couple of days, no sex for a couple of days and you'll be good to go. But they're not educating about, you know what, there are some serious consequences to STIs. You know, and there's some long-term consequences to STIs. So everything's been watered down, that, you know, minimized. The harms of them have been minimized. And I keep saying, I think sex education over the last 10 years, give it another 5 years, and I think that it's going to be seen to have been quite negligent. I think we're going to see a rise in STIs. We're going to see a rise in HIV and potentially AIDS, because people think that, you know, PrEP is the, you know, it's going to prevent HIV. And I have real concerns about it and the way in which it's being used.
Which I think for people of your and my age who went through the Grim Reaper phase of, you know, AIDS education, was that, you know, up until, you know, HIV and AIDS hit, you know, everything that you caught as an STD or an STI could be treated with antibiotics. And then all of a sudden we had AIDS come out of nowhere, and we had to basically start from ground zero to educate people on condoms. Now, I think, you know, we've spoken about this. My fear and yours is that the same thing could happen again, that we go down the pharmaceutical route of PrEP, and we don't teach people that condoms are really, you know, what you need for casual sex. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we get a new HIV, just as we have with this COVID-19. And all of a sudden, our children are watching Grim Reaper commercials on television again.
Yeah, we've been taking a sex positive approach to sex education, and we've minimized the dangers and the consequences of not using condoms, of not using effective contraception. And yeah, we have spoken about sharing the concern that we are going to see a rise in HIV, and I think possibly AIDS, because PrEP's intention, the intention when PrEP first came on the market, it was you had to take this pill every day. Okay, and just like the contraception pill, you had to take it for a specific period of time for it to build up in your system and to offer you a level of protection. Well, now there's a lot of organizations out there that are saying, oh, you only need to take it 2 or 3 days before you have sex. So if you're planning on going to a party next week, oh, here you go, just take your PrEP now and you'll be protected. So, you know, it's, and that's a real concern for me, the way in which it's been promoted, because that's like saying to a female, here you go, here's the contraception pill, take the pill 3 or 4 nights before you go out to the party if you intend on having sex. Oh, don't worry about using the condoms, or don't even mention the condoms. And they're wrongly believing that they're going to have a form of protection, and they're not. They're not going to have that level of protection. And, you know, another interesting point that you raised, Gerard, you talked about our ages, okay, like yours and my age, and we're a lot older than Eric and Jess, and they're still pretty switched on. You and I came from that Grim Reaper period. We come from very conservative education backgrounds. The majority of sex educators that I've come across in my lifetime from varying organizations are all roughly around the same age group. So we subconsciously have all of this awareness, okay? We have all this basic understanding. So when we talk about STIs in a minimalist way, we still have that subconscious in us that we know the dangers. The younger generation has never been exposed to having a fear factor imposed on them to do with sex. This COVID-19 is probably the first virus of danger that's impacting their lives, okay? So they're starting to now get a sense of, you know, having to be careful. The kids are apparently suiciding. I was only reading an article the other day that, you know, a lot of young people are suiciding. But my point is, because the reason that they're suiciding is because they can't understand this danger. My point is that the younger generation has grown up fearless, quite fearless, okay, especially around sex. And the sex education has been a sex positive, sex fearless approach. In 10 years' time is when I think it's going to start hitting them. Sorry, my phone. 10 years' time, you know, when they go from being 16, 17, you know, the 16 to 25-year-olds, they've got this fearless approach to sex, having sex. What's going to happen when they're 35? What's going to be the consequences of that? Are we going to have a pandemic of HIV? Okay, I read research where HIV is rising amongst females, okay, heterosexual females, that it's on the rise. You know, like I said, I just feel that the last 10 years of sex education has been quite negligent. And I think if we don't get on top of it and we don't turn it around soon, we are going to have a pandemic of HIV and potentially AIDS. So this COVID-19, you know, could be a wake-up call to the younger generation about stepping back a bit and taking a little bit more care. But we need to get the education out to them, because we're in a different mind frame, because we live that Grim Reaper. You know, we were a little bit more cautious and careful when we had sexual relationships. They've been told to throw all of care and caution to the wind. it seems to be a bit of a free-for-all. It's a bit of a sexual revolution going on. I think that COVID-19 could actually be a bit of a silver lining that, you know, we're going to have a couple of weeks, a couple of months of non-casual sex. So, you know, apparently on the dating sites, anecdotal evidence is saying that people are talking more, they're engaging more. So those dating sites are still active, but they're engaging in conversations. So rather than just, you know, let's hook up and let's have sex, what they're seeing is that people are actually engaging in conversations and getting to know each other more before they, you know, when COVID-19's finished, then they'll be able to hook up. But, you know, there's a lot of the questions that you guys have said and asked, a lot of the questions that you guys have asked, there's, you could really unpack each one so much more. You know, it's a whole day's worth of sex education right there in your 2 questions.
That's
you know,
awesome.
flipping it back a bit. Yeah. So, but I'll
All
let
right,
you
Jess,
know.
I think you've
Sorry.
got one last question for Tracy.
Yes, let's ask one more. So, a little off the topic, but something we like to ask is, if you could change one thing in the world, what would it be?
I could change one thing. Oh, there's a lot that I'd like to change, actually. I would like to see people engaging in discussions more. If there's one thing that I could really change to do with people, because I'm really passionate about people, I'd like to see more discussions happening rather than more fighting going on between people. We've been able to sit down here and have a discussion. I'm sure when Gerard puts this up, a lot of people are going to come on going, oh my God, her ideas are so wrong. But let's sit down and have, I like discussions. I like people to discuss things more. I don't like it when people throw out names at each other and, you know, say, oh, you're so narrow-minded to have that point of view. I think that's really wrong. I think people should sit down and have more discussions. You'll get to know each other better. You'll get to have a better understanding of perspectives. And I think perspectives are really important. Get to have a better understanding of other people's lived experiences. And I think that you get better outcomes. And that if we were to apply that to a whole range of topics and things that we'd like to change, I think that's the starting point. Come back to discussing. More discussion.
Totally agree. Absolutely. That was excellent. We really appreciated your time. Gerard, is there anything you want to add?
No, not at all.
We really appreciated having you on.
You know, I'm going to keep unpacking your questions all day, Gerard. So when you put this up, I'm going to sit there, if you put it up on YouTube, and I'm going to put a whole lot of comments, because COVID-19 has, you know, I haven't sort of picked up some books or looked at a lot. I kind of put my ideas on the back burner, you know, and I've got a whole lot of personal issues going on, and then this happened, and it was like, oh, just stop right there. So when Gerard said to do this, it was kind of like, yeah, sure, it'll reignite my passion again, and get back out there and yeah, start doing some more good in the world and start igniting those discussions. So
Excellent.
yeah, I'll put a lot of responses up when Gerard puts it up on YouTube, just to go into more depth.
Maybe you'll get your whole your new sex education program put together.
Yeah, I'm going to focus on doing that more. Yeah, yeah, the passion's been reignited, Gerard, especially with your question. It's just really, you know, that it yeah, it really, I don't like the lack of inclusivity of male opinions in our current sex ed. So yeah, he's ignited a fire in me that, yeah, I'll get onto it.
Excellent.
Great talking to you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.